and everybody else is going to speak Ukrainian, just so that we keep on adding to the linguistic richness of the event. So, we're going to take the ideas and the problems that we discussed in the previous panel and try to bring them into the Ukrainian context. And what we really are looking at here is how can you create impactful investigative journalism in a context of cynicism, relativity, and often outright resentment and danger for journalists. So I wanted to start by asking everybody on the panel to help me understand what is the image of a journalist and journalism in Ukraine. In America, there is a cult of the journalist. So every year there's a film about Watergate with Robert Redford playing a journalist. Or there's, the Oscar 2 years ago was won by a film about the investigative department of the Boston Globe. So being a journalist is already seen as something very positive, very necessary, and quite exalted in a way. Even in House of Cards, the journalists are the good guys, the only ones trying to stand up to the evil president. But what is it like here? Do you feel like heroes in your society? Natalia, we'll start with you.
Пітер, я думаю, ти почав з дуже правильного запитання.
Peter, I think that you started with the very important issue. The direct answer and short answer will be no. We have been having these sessions for 3 years in a row now. And I think that Ukrainian journalism had changed considerably during the last 3 years, and we experienced a lot of changes which were not maybe for the best. During that period of time, we had to respond to so many external and internal challenges that I think we did not manage to cope with them in the best way. When we end, instead of bringing journalism into professionally new level, I think that we are moving in opposite direction when our president recently mentioned that Ukrainian journalism has reached unprecedentedly higher level in today's Ukraine. I think this is a good example of alternative fact. As Peter mentioned, journalists as heroes. I don't think that in Ukraine journalists are heroes, and it should not be like this. The natural I observed both natural and artificial trends here. In journalist corporation, we lack unity and coherence between each other. When we face some resistance or obstacles to our activity, we lack self-regulation inside our profession, which does not allow us to respond to those people who discredit our profession, compromise it. For example, on TV, we have a show by some time ago was Vyacheslav Pichovshek, rather famous journalist in Ukraine. And maybe you do not know Peter, but some years ago he was notoriously known among Ukrainian journalists because he discredited the profession and the president Yanukovych time. At the same time, the people in power and even some journalists contribute to discrediting of journalists' profession. That is, both authorities force us to think that we are enemies of society.
People across the country, or people that you know, that you're a journalist, do they go, wow, that's really cool? Or do they say, "Журналюга, you're just a dirty, dirty man"? And why do people react that way?
Вимкнуто, да? Ой, привіт.
Well, some of my acquaintances got accustomed to it. Some people are not ready yet to think this way. It would be good if Pihovshek won't work now for News One TV channel, but would be somewhere on the moon or somewhere on the globe in other place. I think that what is worse, that we cannot be sure that at any moment of time there could appear some News One TV channel in Ukraine that would be happy to get Pihovshek as a showman or newsman for their TV channel. That is, in Ukraine we have a big problem with the history, how our media market was created, and this is reflected on the way how it functions today. When we look at the information teams which work for non-profit media market, they first get some goals, and then they enroll people which might help them to reach these goals. That is what happens in case with Pihovshek. And the audience always feels that and sees that very clearly. Some people, almost all people actually, believe that everything that he says from TV screen, this is commissioned by somebody. On the other fact, as a journalist, I understand that people who disagree with me or does not like what I do, they think the same way about me, that I'm commissioned and paid by somebody. And I believe that 80% of people have similar attitude towards all the journalists. So here we face the same issue of trust, which we drastically lack. On the other hand, we drastically need culture and willingness to change the things. So I think that in 80% of cases, 80% of my time, I'm the journalist as any other journalist in this country.
Скажите, вы... oh, sorry, I'm doing English. I get confused. So you've just made such an important and powerful film about the murder of Pavel Sheremet. Not the first murder at Ukrainskaya Pravda. In another country, I think there would already have been at least 3 mini-series about Gongadze. And there would have been huge outpourings if, I don't know, Britain's, most popular journalist and TV presenter had been murdered and nothing was done. So tell me about the reaction that people have to your film, and why this kind of weird acceptance of these events as normal?
Thank you very much. I often keep saying that we Ukrainians have our yin and yang statements. That is, we always keep speaking about surrender and victory, or treason and victory. And when the murder of Pavlo Sheremet happened, immediately all top officials responded to this. This was Prosecutor General, this was Minister of the Interior, my colleagues and me and my colleagues from Radio Liberty discussed between ourselves the course of investigation and the situation with the freedom of speech. So the government officials responded in some way to this murder, and this was a success, I think. So we could characterize this as victory. But the treason is that very slow investigation. It is weak. We do not see any practical results. And there is the question why official investigation over so many obvious facts which we proved able to find and to collect evidences, while the authorities, official enforcement authorities, having 140 people investigating the case, they managed not to notice. And for us, for my colleagues, it remained unclear whether those law enforcement bodies are inefficient, or they are non-professional, or this is due insufficiently full reform of law enforcement agencies, hiding the old style, whether they are not competent, not professional, or this was the intention, criminal intention behind this poor investigation. But we are in Ukraine, and we always have such things which some government officials would like to hide for now, for some period of time, which nevertheless later, in some 10 years, will become revealed. In these very premises, some 10 years ago, 3 years ago, in this very house, this hangar, we had very, very beautiful boats. And the next day, when Yanukovych fled, we entered this hangar. We found the documents which were thrown out to the sea. We were drying themselves here on the floor. And I recollecting all that, I guess Yanukovych, when he had been a president, he could never imagine that in this very hangar, volunteers would later dry his secret documents. So this emphasizes that the truth reveals itself sooner or later.
The riddle of Ukraine, because on the one hand, this is a country which clearly has, and I have to say this in Russian, протестный потенциал, to an extent that lots of other places don't have, and we've seen that memorably. On the other hand, there is absolutely no reaction almost publicly to the murder of Sheremet, which I thought at least thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people would come out, but no one. So explain to me why on the one hand is this such a passive place and accepting of evil, and at sometimes burning, what is the moment that the Ukrainian becomes motivated to stand up for the truth?
Я думаю, що протестний потенціал.
I believe that the protest potential has such a quality as being depleted, and also it can be accumulated. And I believe that many will agree that the protest that we had in 2013 was not what was just because of the presence in media space of the independent investigatory journalism. And I remember very well how in times of Yanukovych, any investigation that would go on air, on some small TV channels and internet wouldn't cause some big reaction. There were no big protests or no criminal cases launched, and no one would put anyone to the prison. But it was accumulated, all that information was accumulated in the mentality of people, and sooner or later it went out. And now the process is very similar. Now sometimes we get frustrated because after investigation there's no reaction that we would expect, at least after the revolution. But I believe that this protest potential is getting accumulated.
What is your theory of Ukraine's tipping points from passive to protest?
Чисто статистично раз на 10 років.
So statistically once every 10 years. From what I can say, our protest is a quite emotional thing. And the previous protest, the one before the previous one, was a single massive public frustration, like this slogan, "It got me," is about that. You cannot explain it in detail, but you want to hit someone in the face for everything. Kick someone, and to kick someone, that's what we can do. But if we start to split the problem into some specific moments, then the field of what we can accept in this society is very wide. And for me, it's one of the reasons why every investigation doesn't trigger. It's accumulated, it's getting accumulated, and once every 10 years it's getting exploded. I was impressed by the protest moods in the US after the fired director of FBI was telling at open hearings that Trump several times was forcing him to do something during the private meetings, and that is what never happened before. That's not the show. That is, at least those people who I talked to, that is what causes these people to protest personally. This is something unacceptable. Here, the limits of unacceptable are very flexible. That's a big space from left horizon to right horizon. And until you fill it in with emotions, facts, it doesn't start burning. But when everything's accumulated, then it works perfectly well.
Important. But is there also some sort of very Ukrainian silent contract between power and the people? And if that is overstepped, then people start getting very annoyed. So I don't know, you can steal 40% of somebody's budget, but not 60%, that's too much. Is there some sort of is there something that Yanukovych went too far on, but other leaders are clever enough to stay on the other side of? There might not be an answer. I missed your question because this is a not good.
Is there any social contract between people and authorities, and if the authorities cross this border, where the border is? It's more like a discussion for political experts, and like there are many on information channels, you need to look for it. I'd like to say, going back to the previous question, why there are no protests in case of murder of Pavlo Sheremet. The authorities cannot show the result. In this case, the society cannot protest because it doesn't see a specific a person who would be accused or the person who's really involved into this murder, because no one proved that someone is involved into the murder. Otherwise, the Ukrainian society would have come out and they would demand punishment if they knew who's behind this murder. I have no doubts in that, like it was in the case with Georgy Gangadze when Milnichenko tapes were published when ex-president Kuchma was discussing a possible killing of Gangadze, and then everyone, the whole country started just opposing this, and that led to the end of the career of the ex-president Kuchma. In the case with Pavlo Sheremet, the society doesn't know. They're disoriented who to protest against, to demand it from the authorities. This is not the protest. The protest should be specifically against someone, against someone's actions. Where's the limit? Where's the border? In case with Yanukovych, it was clear. He created kleptocratical state, which had fantastic, they were stealing a lot that had fantastic scale. Honka, Mezhigiria is an example of how much was stolen. And people would not go to mass protest. They started protesting only when Yanukovych rejected the European perspective objectively, because he crossed this border. Previously, we knew that he was stealing. People knew that he was stealing. He was stealing a lot, but people thought, let him finish his presidency and then we'll have the next president. But when Yanukovych rejected this European future, then part of the society actively stood up against it, and then it was like a chain reaction. Then the revolution of dignity started. It was force against the force, and this confrontation led to the fall of Yanukovych. Today, I don't know. It's obvious that the society has big expectations as to combating corruption. And if they know about the facts of personal participation of the leadership of the country in large-scale corruption, and this will be proven, because today we can say that, and that is what the President Poroshenko uses politically, that his surrounding, they do not want to expose these corruption scandals. There's his friend Igor Kononenko, and his friend Gladkovsky, and there are corruption investigations against him, but personally the president is not involved into corruption scandals. We cannot say that he stole anything. There are no proofs of that, and if this, save God, happens, then the society can burst, because they will see that the leader of the country who came after Maidan is involved into corruption, and this could become an impetus for the society, like a trigger. I believe that with Yanukovych it would be difficult to compete as to the scales. But there's one more interesting trend which affects the results of journalist investigations. If we compare our publications then, I would say that that was like ignoring something was published, okay, it was there, and then it was it. Now the politicians and authorities are very sensitively perceiving any criticism, and now they created the system of diluting the results of the investigation in the atmosphere of doubts. We're used to the fact when in the end of the investigation nothing happens. They have some templates. They know in advance. We receive their comments, politicians and authorities. They have some templates. As soon as our material is published, they know how to transfer that into some other channel of discussions. An example, when we make a material about Igor Kononenko, that he illegally bought part of land in the reserve, national reserve, and he built some private tennis club, then they substitute this by another another thing. There are many fake accounts, and some people say that we are happy because our children go to this private tennis club. We say that he illegally got that land, and they say that it's a great place for children to get tennis lessons, and that's how they dilute.
Working in this atmosphere and in this culture of doubt, of the sense that an investigation won't necessarily change anything, which is the most depressing thing, you know. And in this overall background where journalism is not necessarily respected, can we find some positive examples in your work where you did manage to grab trust and inspire people? And what can we learn from that in terms of thinking about sort of successful investigative reporting? And what does successful mean if it's not going to bring a revolution tomorrow, if it won't bring a court case? How do you even define success?
Кльове питання.
That's a great question. First of all, absolutely any viewer always believes that the result of the investigation is the corruptionist in prison. That's the most popular.
До цього зараз...
Yeah, also good option. That's the most popular thing. It's like a claim. At least in our case, we tell the journalist why he's not in prison, as if I can put him to prison. But there are two ways. First of all, the way for journalists, when you have material and it leads to some public outrage, and the law enforcement bodies are doing something, at least they start some criminal case. Or you yourself do everything after your material got on air. You write some, I don't know, application. You are pressing the prosecutor's office so that they do something. In both cases, there's some very small probability of getting some result. Is that enough to talk about positive from the point of view of the society? I'm not sure whether that's enough to talk about positive from the point of view of journalism. More than true, because to write some statements, to provide evidence. It's not the work of a journalist. And today, we got to a good level. We're giving information to the society that the society needs to think about. If after that, like the last 3 weeks, we got 3 criminal cases, but is that the result? No, because they're not still in prison. And that's what the society will say. Someone said, to satisfy our society in that is practically impossible. We maybe will receive some license for our own court, for our own police and our own prison. Then we will have 100% result.
That effect is so important. I mean, the movie about Watergate ends with President Nixon being impeached. The Boston Globe movie ends with a lot of priests who are pedophiles being arrested. I suppose the Ukrainian version will always end with a revolution at the end. But short of that, Natalia, are there ways or examples, and the more concrete the better, of where you feel you've had impact? Maybe it was something smaller than a case. Maybe it was you convinced your mother. I don't know. I have relatives who are Trumpists. It's hard to talk to them. I would love to do a piece of journalism which just converted them, but I haven't been able to so far.
У нас тут з Денисом, наприклад, трошки різні бачення.
We have different opinion with Denise. I believe that we need to be engaged in journalism, even if we are investigative journalism. And Denise is mixing up these things. Well, that's just a comment. As to our investigations, the lawyers of some NGOs then apply to the court. But what could be the impact? I believe it should be divided into 2 types. First, it's like a point type development, and the second one is more strategic. As a point type development, we have some successes, some achievements. Like we told that this construction that was added to the House of Trade Unions is illegal. In the result, 4 months later, it was dismantled. We cannot say that that's a great result, but that's a result, it's a point-like result. We said that in the security service of Ukraine, there's a department which is persecuting civil sector. When the representative of security service went to Shabunin's house and was organizing some meeting and was shooting it from the drone. What's the result? Strategically, we understand. We informed the society that the authorities use such methods. But we also had the result of that. According to our information, this person was fired. And I'm not sure that this small result is more important than strategic. And strategic one is in improving some laws, passing some laws, like our numerous investigations on the elite property of Ukrainian civil servants led to understanding in the parliament of the initiative to approve the legislation on mandatory disclosure of the assets of the politicians. And there are many examples like that. Also, I would add to what my colleague said. I would say that I am an optimist and I positively assess our work, the work of every project, investigation project, and there are several reasons to that. First of all, we see that after our investigations, as Natalia said, we see the result. Someone is fired. the criminal cases are filed. I calculated we were making the reports for donors. I would like to thank the representatives of all donors. We thank you for your support because thanks to you we're independent. In these reports I found out that 5 criminal cases were filed by National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and there's some perspective there because the General Prosecution Office also filed some criminal cases, but then they finish up by some new cars, but not by the auto park, yeah, the cars. But that's on the one side hand, but there are some people fired, there are some cases filed in the court, and then sometimes I do some reports for donors. Thank you again, donors, that you're here. Thank you for your support. And I'm looking through our investigations that we did 2 or 3 years ago, and I see who did it. You need to, squeeze the hands of the journalists, because today we would have done it differently. We would have done it better, differently. Basically, I will talk about my project we are developing, and we see that the journalist investigations are developing and they are improving every year. There's improvement. So Ukrainian journalism, investigatory journalism is growing up, and that's good thanks to the criticism. And the third reason for optimism, people need it, they really need it. I had the situation, I was going to the metro from work, and I see there are 3 guys there, they're drinking beer. I don't like when people in the street and public places drink beer. And they were semi-sportive, semi-criminal type guys. They were drinking beer in the street. You know that I'm quite a direct type of a person. I looked at them, I passed by, they probably saw how I looked at them. And I hear, they say, "Can we talk to you for a second?" I turned back, one of them comes, gave the bottle to another one. "I saw your investigation, thank you for doing it."
Beer is the sign of success.
Thank God, the phone will be with me. So, people do need it. And thank you, colleagues, for what you are doing.
Talking about beer, we should be moving towards the end so that everyone can go and have some. But I wanted to sort of raise one last issue. So I was in Denmark recently, and in Denmark there's this very maybe interesting or maybe not movement called constructive news. Now, it's a whole philosophy which starts with the idea that when people watch even good investigative journalism, they get so negative about the world that they don't want to change anything. So even good journalism can have the opposite effect of what it's meant to do. So the constructive journalism movement says, or asks the question, how can one keep on doing dark, real stories? I mean, you're still doing the real thing. But then how can you frame it in a way that leaves people with the sense that they can then go and do something? And there's a whole kind of system that they've developed from, you do the same story, but you ask questions in a different way, a way that's not looking for victims, but looking for ways out of a situation. If you're doing a political debating show, you don't just have them scream at each other. You force them into a situation where they have to look for a solution. Now, that's quite easy in a debating show. I just wonder, how can any of those principles be used in the sort of work you do, which is by its very nature usually dark and depressing, and it should be. I mean, do you think there's a future for that? Is there anything we can learn from it? Finish.
Тобто я правильно зрозумів, що це
Am I right that we write about the problems, but not to depress anybody?
That you have to think about the emotional effect on people, and how do you empower them while being true to the story? So no, you don't say everything's great, but you go, everything's awful, here's what you can do about it, or something like that.
Я думаю, що в цей момент
I think that as of now, I'm thinking about Danish problems, whether they have any big problems, really big problems. I'm not familiar with the Danish realities, unfortunately. But when I try to think about Ukrainian problems, I say, okay, in Ukrainian situation, I may say or state that do not try to steal something and you won't be imprisoned. We have a big problem, for example, with the money which are being stolen, and we have a huge problem with the system of justice, with the courts. We have a large-scale systemic problems, and what can I say, or how can I present those problems not to upset people or to how it may sound a paradox, but the investigative journalism, this is about keeping people inspired and demonstrating that we should stand up for democratic values, that you can have that democratic values if you are ready to protect, to defend the real values, to fight against corruption. I do not think that we deal with the journalism with the intention, investigative journal, with the intention to frustrate people. I try to finish with all my articles with at least pretext, with showing the light at the end of the tunnel. So how we hacked the system. Investigative journalism, this is about disclosures. We disclose who should be blamed or accused for murder, for corruption. This is about bad guys and about disclosure of the actions of that bad guys. But we try to add some positive aspects. Our partners from Canadian public TV, annually they come to Ukraine and organize trainings for our team, and only after third such training I finally understood what they meant and what they want us to produce. One of the key aspects from Canadian or maybe Northern American experience of investigative journalism. Who is your hero? This is a hero. This is a person who stands up against bad guys. And we changed our approach from journalism of facts to journalism of stories. That is, we find characters, heroes who tell us the stories, how they try to cope with corruption, to stand against tortures or violence, and showing these characters we demonstrate to our people who quite often in Ukraine live in a hell, in remote places. We demonstrate that there are people which manage to overcome this terrible situation. One of my colleagues made a story about Larissa Gomek. This was a judge from Poltava who rejected to falsify court hearings and to produce court ruling in favor of the perpetrator. And she stood up against the system. She was offered a bribe, although she lives in rather modest conditions. She was offered a rather big bribe. Her husband is an archaeologist. They have rather modest income, and nevertheless, she rejected that bribe. And when she made this story, there were several thousands of reviews of that story in the internet. I think that such examples inspire people, showing that people in the regions, common people in the regions, they are brave enough to stand up against the system. And finally, these people change the situation for the better. Now the same judge, Larissa, Larissa was put forward as a nominee to the anti-corruption court, as a nominee for a judge of anti-corruption court by professional Judges Association, which advises to the government on justice reform issues. I think this shows that it's a success.
Questions before we turn to the beer? Oh my God, they have questions. Okay. Well, I don't know. We have a problem with reverberation.
Я думаю, слышно меня, да?
Да. Ой, слышно стало.
Can you hear me? Yeah, there is obvious progress. I'm Oleg Sokhov from Kyiv Post. Many people might agree that Yanukovych was a rather silly guy. Poroshenko is much more intelligent, and some people use gestures. I think that Poroshenko's propaganda is designed much better. It is of high quality. He maybe uses Russian propaganda experts, and he keeps saying that in the situation of war with Russia, all those who criticize the president, they are acting in favor of the enemies. And I think for the first time in Ukraine, we have people who sincerely respect power and hate those who criticize people in power, like volunteers, civic activists, etc. I think in this situation there is a threat that Poroshenko will be elected for the second term, and there is a threat of real totalitarianism. But and how do you think that there is a chance for Ukraine to become a Putin-like state, that people will be zombied in some way? We are in the beginning of this way, but this may happen to Ukraine. That's a good question. Even if you have the analog of Milosevic and Tudjman. This is a deeply personal vision. Poroshenko does not represent the whole power. Now we have more or less competitive power field. There are some people who sincerely like Poroshenko and are eager to defend him against other against opponents. Whether we have people, but we have people who like Avakov, who like Lyashko, who like Tymoshenko. That is the admirers of Tymoshenko. They, excuse me, of Poroshenko. They are not unilateral. They are not alone in this country. But about Poroshenko, his attitude, but what's going on now in Ukraine with the attitude towards activists and journalists, that's more dangerous. An efficient result of this phenomena might be more systemic pro-totalitarian movement, and I'm not sure that such totalitarian or pro-totalitarian movement might appear. Whether we will have a Ukrainian Nashi movement or not. I am also from Kyiv Post. Quite often you face the consequences of any investigation. Whether you had disputes about worthiness to go to SBU after your investigation. Now there is Tymoshenko case, and even NABU opened case against her. Whether you had any reproaches from Batkivshina when you filed such cases? You mean any threats? No, the threats had transformed, I think. They come in different form. The last week we prepared a story about exclusive cars which belong to the security service of Ukraine. They had, we understood that they might have questions or issues with it. just 1 hour before the release of that story, we received an answer, official answer from them saying that if we release the story on TV, we might be sued in court. So I think that this was incorrect. I would like to add about discussion which was a result of our investigation about Pavlo Sheremet that came from Minister Avakov. Avakov said that journalists with their facts should immediately go to the investigator but not release such stories. So I called to my colleagues from Canadian CBC and asked them a question. We had our parallel investigation with the law enforcers and whether journalists which have such journalist investigation, whether they need to go with their facts directly to the law enforcers, especially in a situation when they have doubts about the integrity of those law enforcement bodies. And my colleague from Canada said me the following: that's nonsense. You should not inform law enforcers about your facts, because a journalist, as a citizen, as a national, has the right to call to police only in case you have some facts before the deed is planned or before the deed is committed. If you know about or have some information about murder, about conspiracy, about something, some threats, so you have to inform the law enforcers. But afterwards, when the deed is already committed, you have all the rights to carry out your independent investigation as far as you wish. So that criticism from the Ministry of the Interior was incorrect. When we are criticized, I recollect the Chinese saying the world is created to create obstacles for you. I will ask the question very quickly. Well, I became very much intrigued. Can you tell me what threats came from the SBU? You live in a rather risky country. Very quickly, very different threats. On Twitter, we got messages that those journalists should be shot by a sniper. These are not direct threats, but this is aggression. Some people may be terrified. Or when we understand that we are surveyed, that our telephone calls are interfered, and we understand that they hear what we say, that we are traced back. So this is done to make psychological pressure that you are under continuous surveillance. And how do you distinguish what is a serious intimidation and what is just a general aggression? Of course, we keep this in mind, but we do not take any specific measures. I tried to question people when you were discussing the issue, but my colleagues said nobody tried to intimidate them. When the material, any story is released, there is no sense to intimidate you. You may express how angry you are, how you may throw out your aggression, but that's actually what is not taken seriously. When we started the criminal process against Batkivshina party, we heard a lot of new things about ourselves. All 12% of her supporters tried to blame us, but I think that all the threat, all the intimidation comes before publication. Let's take several questions. I shifted to Russian. Okay. It's not a question. I'm Olga Paley. I come from Dnipro. I have a recommendation. I observe my Kiev colleagues work with admiration, but when we mentioned trust and the lack of trust to journalists, because we write about money, so I always keep thinking with money. Everybody knows that all TV channels belong to the oligarchs, and when each story is released, immediately people start to say that this was commissioned by Kolomoisky, by Pinchuk, by other oligarch. When any involves somebody's interests, people immediately say that this article was commissioned by this and that forces. I would like to express my gratitude to the international funds which provide grants, and each time when we write, when we read something, we ask ourselves a question: who has paid? And when we are asked, how have you got money for that investigation? When we say that this was paid from Renaissance Foundation, then this raises no further question. Then decentralization, which successfully was held in the country, financial decentralization, and during the last 2 years, local governments got the reign of money. I know local politicians who planned to go to the Verkhovna Rada, and now they decided to stay at home in the regions. And looking at good work of our Kiev colleagues, I feel that we in the regions lack professionalism, we lack capacity, and we lack money, frankly speaking. So I encourage you to build up partnerships with regional journalists for us to be able to use better technique and equipment, for us to be able to.
Okay, please ask brief questions, because then our guys will be in a difficult situation. Anastasia Rusai, CTV. 10 minutes ago, Dmytro said that the journalist has to work on investigation as long as he needs. The question is, if you go out every week did it happen that you had to put on air some material that you didn't finish, or maybe you understood there's something that you can add? Yes, you. Sergey Guz. Talking about post-truth, there's a new phenomenon of alternative investigation, like alternative facts, alternative investigations. I know Dmitry Gnap from his Panama Papers. That was like a version of alternative investigation that shows differently the facts. Do we need to fight this phenomenon, and what could be could oppose it? Another question. I am Oleg Yanko. I am from the National University named after Franco. I would like to ask you what to do when the journalist feels pressure from the authorities, and I would like to ask you, are you planning to conduct investigation on stealing the money from the budget because of the war, related to the war? You mentioned war. Anti-terrorist operation, or in other words, war. Briefly, answers to all three questions. We're talking about regions, that it's worth working in regions. Our project has partners in Rivne, Mykolaiv, different Ukrainian cities in Kiev. We also work as to our materials that could be not finished. This happens. Very often we clarify the facts after the investigation was published or was on air, and then you believe that, okay, next program we will prepare a follow-up for the next program. Like in the previous program, we told about that, and then we found out about something else, and we'll tell about that today. It works well. Talking about investigation of stealing money during the war, at the war, we were touched upon that topic, starting from, we had a series about 8 publications or 8 programs, how they steal in production plants of Ukrainian weapons. A year and a half, Gnap went there and he showed how the goods are moving across the line and the contact line, and that is important topic. We are also open for regional investigations. Just give us topics, and if such topics could be shown at the national level, we send our group that's realistic. As to grants, such programs as Slidstvo.info schema, Nashi, Groshi, we believe that there's a request of the society to get such information, but agree we are almost working underground. We are not on big channels. The TV channels of oligarchs do not need such programs. And because there's no media market, the guys have to take grants. We're financed from the American budget, practically directly, but these are not market conditions. And thanks to such independent source of independent financing in Ukraine, we managed to do some independent things. And that's what the authorities are afraid of. And that is why they invented this theory of conspiracy about grant eaters. And they discredit such teams, independent teams of investigators. I would like to emphasize that it also depends on us, how these things will be disseminated. For example, they substitute the notion when owners of the TV channels make non-journalists journalists. and they disseminate the information via these non-journalists. I started from saying that we need to get together, to get united and call things proper names. We need to say that the provocator cannot call himself a journalist. We cannot, and he cannot use the defense, the protection which is given to journalists according to the law. Blogger is not a journalist, especially if he has this certificate of the assistant to the MP. Again, one more round of questions. Okay, I cannot give you twice. Let me take others. Tell us, please, whether the fact that in Ukraine there's a war going on, did it affect you following journalist standards? Maybe you say because of the war we have to be patriots and we cannot disclose such topics. Did you have such discussions in your programs? Sergei Gus was asking about alternative investigations. Let's collect all the questions. This will be another round. Up there. Andrei Vashchenko. I have a question. Researching, seeing how, as a citizen, the Ukrainian journalism, is it possible to ask a question about transfer from statistics and control to motivation and trust? To how some programs, some report will help improve the life of people? Basically, the presence of ideology in journalism. There are many proposals, as I know, on reforming the system globally, in discussions on local self-governance, on justice. They're not perceived so well by journalists as some violations. It's good when they disclose some corruptionist, but another one comes, replaces him, then the third one replaces the second one. And also another question, the middle class interest. Is the middle class interested in the activity of journalists? External financing, we can understand it now, but the main question is why there's no financial request from the society. Maybe it is important for journalists to take into account the ideological component. And we include another question on alternative investigations. I did not understand your question, really. I understand. We saw that. Some of our former colleagues were publishing their materials after our investigation on the murder of Pavlo Sheremet. It was called Semi-Truth from Journalists. We need to take it into account. If that is getting disseminated actively, then we need to comment that in Facebook. I believe that's enough. That's enough. Basically, we can say that very often the authorities are using these things to basically demonstrate that the journalists are stupid ones, they don't understand, they're non-competent, and that is quite an effective thing. One thing you need to understand, whether it's worth paying attention to that and promote such things, or maybe disregard it, let it just settle down. I will say a few words about ideology, ideological component. When you're asking a question on why journalists are not so much interested in the review of reforms, they're more interested in the corruptionists. The answer is simple. For the viewer, unfortunately, it's more interesting to know about the corruptionists, but not to hear about reforms. Once we're talking about elections to the Supreme Court, we can explain many times some methodological problems, and we are doing that. But people would watch, would look at some crook who passed this competition, who passed this exam. And that is about the attention of a viewer. And what's the most effective, and that's the reality, is to sell some systemic ideas via personal problems, because people want to watch specific problems. Then, if I may, I will add on patriotism. That's a new paradigm which is imposed on us by the authorities. Now we are all immersed into that. They are basically limiting our freedoms, the freedom of speech, because of the war, and that is thesis which is disseminated by these hybrid channels, by people who call themselves journalists, and they unfortunately discredit our profession. But everything's simple in our company. We are criticizing not the country, we are criticizing specific representatives who are managing the country, and then this dilemma is resolved. We are criticizing not the country but the authorities, and we are doing it using specific facts. I would add, just asking this question, when you are telling about some specific things, when you are telling about some violations of the law, you have to sort of explain that it's not because you're not patriot, but because people are bad. Just the existence of this situation now is a problem, because, I don't know, the idea, well, you are patriot, how can you talk like that about the president or about the minister? This shouldn't be even mentioned. These are different notions. And I am infuriated when someone starts defining what is patriotism and is trying to somehow translate that to, or spread it to the surrounding. Peace.
Some valuable thoughts. I think, are we ready to go and do something else, or еще есть вопросы?
Or are there any questions? No.
Я не могу два раза.
Twice, no. You will ask later. I had that was a rhetoric question. Is that so important? If that's so important, many publications do not do that, and we do not give the materials. For many times I heard from journalists, "Thank you for the interview. We will send you this material so that you read it." As far as we understand, you can give this material to a person who can change it. It's Kolomoisky said, "Why didn't you give it to me to read it again?" He didn't understand why he wasn't given it. How should the journalist act? Send? Not to send. Send? Should I give you a specific public quotation? We're in a public place. That's a joy of the TV. Everything that the camera got is mine. But why we have this anachronism when it's interview, with the interview for publications, someone promises once a year to throw it out of the legislation, but there's no support. There's no support. Everyone wants to be co-author. 450 people want to be co-authors. But the only organic and correct solution is yes. And I need to say some good words in the end, that for us people who live in Denmark or in England, we're not journalists. I don't know what I've been doing for several years, but for us, or when I come to Nova Gazeta in Moscow and I see the portraits of murdered journalists, for us, you are real journalists. And I don't know whether you can inspire your people or maybe just once in 10 years, but you inspire us. I believe that journalists here are referred to as the marker of bravery, and that's constructive, positive, that you give to all the world. And thank you for that. I'm sorry, my lawyers are here and they will condemn me. Regional colleagues, if you want to continue your investigation, write to us. Our lawyers will do all this work instead of you. They will get involved. That's a minute of promotion. Write to us and they will do it. Thank you.